If you know anything about Nintendo, you know that they sue. A lot. Like a whole lot. Be it Atari, Tengen, Blockbuster, Galoob, Nintendo really gets involved in lawsuits, and definitely more frequently than other video game companies. As the holders of some exceptionally valuable gaming brands, including Mario, Zelda, and more, the company is deeply dependent on brand perception and popularity to generate a profit. Now, they aren't alone in this, and many other companies in the entertainment industry are in similar situations. However, Nintendo has taken the idea of protecting their intellectual property to a degree that gets a little bit nuts. How nuts? Well, according to their website, Nintendo has, quote, supported over 600 actions in 16 countries, a statistic that is certainly out of date. This begs the question, why? Why is Nintendo so lawsuit happy? Why have they sought legal actions against so many different streamers, game modders, and more? In this video, we're going to take a broad view of all of the ways that Nintendo has used legal tools to protect their brand, and talk about why this is the case. It's not possible to have a conversation about Nintendo's IP or intellectual property overprotection without first having an understanding of the company's origins. The company was founded in Japan in 1899 as Nintendo Koppai, where it made Hanafuda cards. Its turn to toys and video games began in 1973 when it began to make shooting games and acquired the rights to distribute other video game systems. The Famicom, short for Family Computer and the Japanese version of the Nintendo, launched in 1983 and became the country's most popular video game system at the time, battling through technical issues and becoming even more popular after Nintendo replaced, free of charge, faulty graphics chips that froze the system. By 1988, one-third of Japanese households had the Famicom. By 1990, Nintendo was the most successful corporation in Japan, surpassing Toyota. Of course, the success was not without fighting two major and important battles, both of which, I would argue, shaped Nintendo's approach to protecting its intellectual property. The first was the crash of 1983. This infamous tanking of the video game market, like all economic downturns, had many causes. One of the most important ones was the sheer oversaturation of the video game market and the lack of quality that came with this oversaturation. The era of third-party developers, or developers who weren't directly affiliated with a video game system, began in 1979, when Activision was founded by 4 Atari programmers who were upset with their treatment and the direction of Atari. When courts found that third-party developers could operate and publish to systems, the floodgates exploded. Atari failed to properly control for these third-party developers, many of whom didn't care about the quality of their games and were only in the business to make a quick buck. Third-party developers proliferated everywhere. In 1982, there were a mere 17 third-party developers that exhibited at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show. The next year, there were 100. During the same period, the amount of games available for the Atari quadrupled, growing from 100 to 400. This glut in inventory and declining quality also meant that consumers had more options than ever, meaning that individual companies suddenly had more games to sell, but were actually selling less games. As a result, prices were slashed, bottom line suffered, and the crash was on. Revenue from the video game industry fell dramatically in the United States, declining from $3 billion in 1983 to barely $100 million in 1985. Fortunately for Nintendo, it was able to emerge largely unscathed from that crash, as it had yet to launch the Famicom in the United States, and the '83 crash was mostly centered in the US market, ultimately setting the stage for a massive increase for, you guessed it, Japanese companies. By the time Nintendo launched in the United States in September 1986, it was ready to protect its brand. However, beforehand, Nintendo had run headfirst into a second scourge of the video game industry: bootleg and counterfeit games. This problem was particularly prevalent in Japan, where the counterfeit systems got a name of their own: Famiclones. These clones and other unauthorized games were sold to be played on the Famicom system, designed by bootleggers and back-alley programmers who figured out how to use the lack of a lockout system for the Famicom to make their own profit. In many cases, these systems were also meant to completely replace the Famicom itself. Other times, programmers sold multi-cart games or cartridges that came with 2 or more games. These games did well in Japan, but they were particularly popular in other developing countries, which often had a lack of protections for other intellectual property. These systems would run official and unofficial games, thus rendering copyright protection that Nintendo would later develop to be moot. This, understandably, represented a huge problem for Nintendo, which would have to pursue formal legal action to stop the proliferation of these games with varying degrees of success. According to the book Game Over, Nintendo estimated that it lost an astonishing $100 million to Donkey Kong clones during the 1980s. At one point, as many as half of the Donkey Kong games on the market were estimated to be counterfeit, requiring Nintendo to work with law enforcement across the world and potentially even battle mafia connections to take down these counterfeit rings. These problems with counterfeit products continued throughout Nintendo's early days. An early hit in Japan and Asia was the Game & Watch systems, which were essentially miniaturized, pocket-sized versions of early Nintendo games. Counterfeiting was such a problem with these systems that Nintendo once estimated that as many genuine watches were sold as counterfeit ones. And 40 million of these watches were sold in Japan and Asia. From the crash of 1983 and the rise of bootleg games, Nintendo learned valuable lessons that would steer the company in a direction that emphasized quality and control, perhaps to an excessive degree. To publish with Nintendo, third-party developers had to become an official licensee of the system. To do so, developers had to adhere to content standards from the company. They were told what content was acceptable and what wasn't. They were allotted a certain amount of cartridges, all of which were manufactured by Nintendo, and given both minimums and maximums of how many games they could order. This forced developers into a major bind, as they had to take an educated guess on how many games to order. Order too few, and they may fail to meet market demand. Order too many, when cash was due up front, and they may go broke. Now, that's not to say that Nintendo was motivated only by creativity and intellectual honesty. The book Game Over, which describes Nintendo's rise as the video game titan both in Japan and America, paints the CEO during the 1980s, Hiroshi Yamauchi, in an extremely negative personal light, noting that Yamauchi would regularly manipulate third-party developers against each other, keeping licensees stuck to Nintendo's incredibly stringent controls simply because he could. Said one distributor about the relationship between licensees and Yamauchi, quote, "They feared him like a marionette fears the puppeteer. If a company upsets Nintendo, he could cut the strings." With no real competition in the market, and with competitors like Sega, PlayStation, and Xbox years or decades away, developers had to suffer through Nintendo's strict demands. Regardless of the motivation, Nintendo developed an intelligent and sophisticated way to protect their brand. Meet the 10NES lockout chip. This sharp 4-bit SM590 microcontroller was placed in every single Nintendo console. Every cartridge, and remember, all of them were manufactured by Nintendo, had a corresponding chip. Upon boot up, the 10NES would request a code from the key placed in every game. Once that key was given, the game started. Failing that, the system would reset and fail to start. This lockout chip proved to be effective, although not foolproof. Some bootleg games still found their way around the 10NES, although it was difficult to do so. For example, Wisdom Tree Games, that's the so-called, quote, Christian developer that made Christian-themed games when they realized that they could make a small fortune by tapping a previously ignored market, more on that in a different video, sent a small charge that temporarily disabled the 10NES. And then there was Tengen. Tengen was a subsidiary of Atari that made games for the Nintendo. Angry over Nintendo's draconian limitations and in the middle of an expensive legal battle over Tetris, Tengen engineers used some legal subterfuge to gain access to the 10NES patent. The incredibly complex scheme they used? They lied to the US Patent Office and said that they needed the patent as part of a lawsuit. Remarkably, this simple scheme worked, and they were able to manufacture unlicensed games via the creation of their Rabbit system, which allowed Tengen to work around the Nintendo's 10NES system. A lawsuit inevitably followed, and it was one that Tengen would lose, with the company being forced to issue refunds for their unlicensed version of Tetris. However, the fight stirred attention in America, and that ultimately led to legal action. An investigation began in the 1990s. In 1994, Nintendo settled these investigations without admitting wrongdoing, easing licensing restrictions, and offering discounts to consumers based on allegations of price fixing. So, put yourself in Nintendo's shoes for a moment. The US government has just brought down the legal hammer and forced changes that, if you're Nintendo, limit your control over the market and your own product. As a result, you've lost many tools at your disposal to continue to limit the proliferation of attacks on your intellectual property and product. If you're Nintendo, and you truly believe that you're being constrained in how you can make money, you're probably going to use every tool in the legal toolbox in order to protect yourself. Of course, everything we've talked about barely even scratches the surface, because what really brought Nintendo's aggressive legal maneuvers to the forefront was the internet. It goes without saying that the internet changed every aspect of our lives, and undoubtedly had a negative impact on Nintendo's efforts to control their IP. Once upon a time, cracking down on bootlegs and Famiclones was just a matter of limiting the physical exchange of these illicit goods. The internet obviously changed things dramatically, and made Nintendo's life much harder. Still, don't feel too bad for Nintendo. Perhaps the earliest way that the internet challenged Nintendo's IP control efforts was with the emergence of ROMs. For the unfamiliar, ROMs are short for read-only memory, and ROMs are files that take data from video game cartridges and allow players to use those ROMs when paired with another program known as an emulator. In other words, ROMs allowed players to play Nintendo games without buying the Nintendo themselves. ROMs also gave way to ROM hacks, whereby skilled programmers could modify the ROM itself, enabling developers to change the content of the ROM. This led to some fun games with new stages and some really disturbing versions of different games. For many, this was pure nostalgia. Time had often rendered the original Nintendo unusable, so ROMs allowed players to enjoy games that they'd never be able to play otherwise. Nintendo didn't quite see it that way. They viewed the mass proliferation of ROMs as an effort by players to enjoy their intellectual property without paying a price. Nintendo also aggressively pushed back on the notion that ROMs did them no harm, noting that ROMs were illegal even if you already owned the game. Nintendo has repeatedly sued the owners of ROM sites, and in most cases, courts sided with Nintendo, ordering sites removed and often ordering the owners of these sites to pay Nintendo serious financial damages. This has happened repeatedly. In 2021, Nintendo won an order to have the website ROM Universe taken offline and required that all of the ROMs on the website be permanently destroyed. In addition to the $2.1 million judgment it won against the site and its owner, Matthew Storman. In 2023, a Paris Court of Appeals awarded Nintendo nearly $500,000 after D-Storage refused to take down the ROMs on their website. Obviously, these efforts are about more than just shutting down websites. Nintendo is also trying to send a message to operators. If you take our content, we will make you pay. Consider Nintendo's statement after it won its lawsuit against D-Storage. Quote, Nintendo is pleased with the decision of the Paris Court of Appeals as it again sends a clear message that in refusing to remove or withdraw access to unauthorized copies of video games, despite prior notification, share hosting services such as D-Storage are liable under French law and must remove or block access to such content and may be liable to pay compensation. Then there's the case of Gary Bowser. No, seriously, that's actually his name. Bowser created and sold devices that enabled users to play pirated copies of Nintendo games, which, according to Bowser's own lawyers, cost Nintendo a, quote, substantial amount of money. Bowser pled guilty to 2 piracy-related charges and was sentenced to 40 months in jail. Less defensible is Nintendo's actions against streamers and YouTubers. The rise of platforms like YouTube and Twitch has represented a loss of control for marketers and big business. It was like the ultimate fan club. Fans could now create content on their own without needing to check with the boss first. Many brands realized the potential of fan-made content and embraced it, often giving fans tools to succeed in streaming or, at a bare minimum, leaving them alone. Nintendo took a different approach. Before 2023, they claimed all ad revenue associated with their videos on YouTube, meaning that creators saw no money if their videos were allowed online at all. In 2015, Nintendo developed the Nintendo Creators Program. This allowed for YouTubers to create Nintendo content and get a piece of that sweet, sweet advertising revenue, as long as they met Nintendo's stringent rules and regulations. This meant that videos, including Let's Play videos, had to clear Nintendo's approval process. What was in that process? Well, a Vox article described it as a, quote, black box, though Nintendo officials noted that the video had to be family-friendly, meaning no swearing. This process was eventually completely canceled, and it was noted by observers that the strangeness of the program would almost have an impact that Nintendo didn't want. If creators wanted money, they would almost certainly seek platforms that allowed for full monetization with no strings attached, thus driving streamers and YouTubers away from Nintendo and towards other platforms. The Nintendo Creator Program may have been canceled, but that's not to say that Nintendo eased up their restrictions, or that they let go of their control over internet properties. Nintendo has used hundreds of DMCAs, which is short for Digital Millennium Copyright Act, in order to take down unauthorized content on internet platforms. Sometimes this was just videos of their products. Other times it was fan-made games or mods. Indeed, a wealth of information can be found on the website suedbynintendo.com. The fact that this website exists is, not great for Nintendo. It's not great. And finally, let's not act as if counterfeiting went away just because the 1980s did. The problem has unquestionably continued. Nintendo has worked with legal authorities across the world to shut down counterfeit rings, spending millions of dollars and seeking a maximum of punishment. For example, in 1991, Nintendo worked with government officials to make arrests in Chicago, San Jose, Miami, Los Angeles, and more, specifically targeting Taiwanese counterfeit operations that had taken root in the United States. Among those targeted in this 1991 effort were executives from the company United Microelectronics, which was, among other things, the largest semiconductor manufacturer in Taiwan. Things got real awkward when it turned out that the Taiwanese government actually had a 30% stake in the company. So, just how bad was this problem? In 1990, Nintendo estimated that they had lost more than $1 billion in sales due to the efforts of Taiwanese counterfeit games, with an estimated 100 million counterfeit games sold in the United States that year. Nintendo took none of this lightly. It sought maximum jail sentences, coordinated efforts with law enforcement, and made a huge deal out of any counterfeit bust. Need any proof? Here's a 1994 press event in which Mario literally destroys 10,000 counterfeit games with a steamroller. The age of this picture 1000% makes it look like Mario is committing a war crime. These repeated run-ins with pirates impacted more than just Nintendo's stance towards social media. They also impacted game design decisions. When the PlayStation came out in 1994, it became one of the first game systems to use CDs rather than cartridges to sell its games. The decision gave Sony more storage space, quicker speeds, and cheaper manufacturing costs. It was also preferred by game developers. However, Nintendo declined to switch to CDs, a decision that is maintained to this day. Its fifth-generation system was the N64, which still used cartridges. Its successor, the GameCube, used mini CDs. Part of the reasoning for this was Nintendo's continued problems with gaming pirates and counterfeit games. Let's go back to our original question. Why? Why is Nintendo so aggressive with its IP protection efforts when other companies, including Xbox and Sony, are not nearly as stringent or lawsuit happy? First, let's get something straight. Nintendo is usually within their legal rights to take down content. After all, it's theirs. Look, I get it. Everyone thinks Nintendo is the big bad guy, and in some cases, there's no doubt that that's fair. But Nintendo owns their games and has always had very, very stringent takes on what is and is acceptable for their brand. Furthermore, maybe more than most, Nintendo has a multi-decade history of struggling with counterfeiters, illegal mods, and poor quality products. As the oldest of the surviving video game systems, Nintendo saw what it was like when poor products nuked an entire industry. That has probably given them a very unique perspective and set of values that you won't find with Xbox or PlayStation. However, that's not to say that always acting on those values is a good thing, and just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should. As Nintendo has proven time and time again, smashing small streamers isn't good for business. Yes, Nintendo has undoubtedly lost billions to counterfeit operations. That's wrong. And Nintendo undeniably has every right to work with legal authorities to stop bad actors. And I get the argument that ROMs aren't costing Nintendo money, but at a minimum, you've got to see things from Nintendo's perspective. It's their product. If anyone gets to decide how to use it, and decided when to use it, it's them. Less defensible, and frankly even self-destructive, is Nintendo's actions towards YouTubers or streamers. Nintendo has pushed away its biggest fans, discouraged innovation, and told content creators that they really didn't want their help. More importantly, it just left a bad taste in the mouths of fans who actually like them. In many cases, fans weren't seeking profit. They were seeking what we all seek when we play video games: joy. And a community of other players. When Nintendo has broken up otherwise harmless streamers, they're shooting themselves in the foot and telling their most valuable fans that they don't want their support. As you can hopefully see, I tried to use this video to give a more nuanced take, and as always, I would love to hear what you have to say, since I know at least a few of you are inevitably screaming at me right now. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please like or subscribe, or please click on the next video that the almighty YouTube algorithm has generated for you. Have a wonderful day out there, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I liked making it. Take care, everybody.